Welcome to Founding Chronicles. If you enjoy stories of America's past and hidden history, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Now, let's begin Asterisk, when people look back at the golden age of American cinema. They often think of the big productions, the sprawling epics filled with sweeping music and glamorous stars. Yet sometimes, the films that last the longest, the ones that dig into the hearts of generations, are not the ones with the biggest budgets or the flashiest sets. Sometimes they are small stories, set in one room with only a handful of characters. But they cut so deeply into human truth that they feel larger than life. 12 Angry Men, released in 1957, is one of those rare films. For many Americans, it was more than just a courtroom drama. It was a mirror. It was a window into what justice is supposed to be, what America claims to stand for, and what ordinary men can do when they wrestle with conscience, prejudice, and truth. Yet behind this powerful film lies a web of strange facts, overlooked details, and forgotten history. And when you uncover them, you begin to see 12 Angry Men not just as a great movie, but as a cultural event, something that could only have happened in America during the mid-20th century, when the country was changing, struggling, and searching for its identity. The first strange fact about this movie is that it almost never existed. Today, people look at 12 Angry Men as a masterpiece, a film that appears on every critic's list of the greatest American movies of all time. But back in the 1950s, no major studio believed in it. The idea of making a movie almost entirely in one small, stuffy jury room seemed absurd. Studios wanted adventure films, musicals, westerns. They wanted spectacle. And here came Reginald Rose, the man who wrote the story, offering them 12 men sitting at a table, talking. It sounded like certain failure. And yet Rose knew something the studios didn't: a drama of real human conflict, when told honestly, could be more gripping than any gunfight or dance number. Rose had been inspired by his own life. Years earlier, he had served on a jury himself. He remembered the long hours, the weight of the decision, the clash of opinions, the way men brought their prejudices and their temperaments into that small room. He remembered how tense and electric it felt, 12 strangers locked in a room, holding the fate of another human being in their hands. And so, he took that experience and wrote it as a television play in 1954. It aired live on CBS's Studio One series. For an hour, American viewers sat in their living rooms and watched 12 actors argue over the guilt of a young man accused of murder. It was simple, raw, and it struck a chord. Here's the second strange fact: 12 Angry Men was never meant to be a movie at first. It was just television. And in those days, television drama was seen as disposable. Programs aired once, live, and then vanished into memory. Nobody thought they would be remembered decades later. But when Henry Fonda, one of America's most respected actors, saw the television version, he couldn't let it go. He believed the story had to be put on the big screen. And without Fonda, there would be no film. Henry Fonda is at the center of the third strange fact, and it is perhaps the most astonishing one. He not only starred in the movie, but he put his own money on the line to make it happen. Fonda was not a producer. He was an actor. But he believed so deeply in the script that when studios refused to finance it, he co-produced it with the director, Sidney Lumet. He put up his own reputation and his own wallet for a story that most of Hollywood thought was doomed to imagine. An actor today doing that, risking career and fortune for an unconventional courtroom drama, is nearly impossible. Yet Fonda did it, because for him, it wasn't just entertainment. It was about truth, justice, and the American spirit. Sidney Lumet, the director, brought his own history to the project, and that's the fourth strange fact. Lumet was not yet famous. He was young, hungry, and known mainly for directing live television. 12 Angry Men was his very first feature film. Most directors start with something safe, something easy, something that proves they can handle Hollywood. Machinery. But Lumet went straight into one of the most difficult challenges a director could face. How to make 12 men in one room visually interesting for 96 minutes. If handled poorly, it would have been dull, claustrophobic, or stagey. But Lumet turned the limitations into strengths. He used the camera to slowly tighten the walls, shooting with wider angles at the beginning and gradually switching to longer lenses, so that as the arguments heated up, the room seemed smaller and smaller, pressing in on the men. The audience didn't notice the trick consciously, but they felt it, and it added to the tension. That was not just filmmaking. It was psychology. Now, here is the fifth strange fact. Every single shot of the movie was done inside one room. There are no escapes, no flashbacks, no dramatic scenes outside of the jury. That may not sound shocking today, when audiences are used to independent films experimenting with minimal settings. But in 1957, it was unheard of. Even courtroom dramas usually cut back and forth between lawyers, witnesses, and judges. But here, the trial is already over. The movie begins with 12 men walking into a jury room, and it never leaves. That choice was radical, and it worked. The sixth fact brings us deeper into the film's soul. Not a single juror is ever given a name. They are only known as juror number 1, juror number 2, and so on. This was not laziness. It was deliberate. The idea was that they could be any Americans, any men pulled from the streets and asked to serve. They were stand-ins for all of us, with our doubts, our prejudices, our flashes of compassion, and our stubborn pride. By stripping away their names, the story became universal. Viewers were invited to see themselves in those seats. In fact, when audiences watched the film in 1957, many people walked out shaken, not because of what happened to the accused boy, but because they recognized themselves in the faces of those jurors. But here is the seventh strange fact. The movie was a failure when it was released. Yes, you heard that right. Today, it is hailed as one of the greatest American films ever made. But in 1957, it barely earned back its cost. It was released in limited theaters, with little publicity, and most audiences simply didn't go. People wanted comedies, musicals, or adventure pictures. A grim, talk-heavy film about a jury was not what the average ticket buyer thought of as entertainment. Fonda was deeply discouraged. He even swore he would never produce a movie again. But here's the twist. While it failed at the box office, critics loved it. They praised its realism, its moral weight, and its daring style. And slowly, through television reruns and classroom screenings, it built a second life. By the 1970s and 80s, it had become a staple in schools, law classes, and history courses. It was no longer a forgotten failure. It was a classic. The eighth fact lies in its moral vision. The film was released in 1957, at the dawn of the Civil Rights era, when America was struggling with questions of race, prejudice, and justice. Boy on trial in the movie is never identified by race, but many viewers at the time assumed he was from an immigrant or minority background. The film doesn't say, but it didn't need to. The jurors' arguments, their suspicions, their biases, all reflected the struggles America was facing. That silence, the refusal to specify, allowed the movie to stand as a symbol for prejudice. In all its forms, to many viewers, it was about race. To others, about class. To still others, about the way America treats the powerless. In the quietest of ways, it was a radical statement. Fact 9 is more personal, more human. During filming, the cast spent long days together, sweating under the hot lights in a cramped studio set designed to feel like a suffocating jury room. The tension on screen was real because the actors themselves began to feel trapped and irritable. Sidney Lumet shot the movie in less than 3 weeks, but he rehearsed the cast for 2 solid weeks beforehand, like a stage play. By the time cameras rolled, the men knew each other's rhythms, tempers, and habits. They argued in character, but sometimes they argued as themselves. That authenticity seeps into every frame. And here is the 10th fact, one that almost feels like destiny. The film received almost no awards attention in America, but it was celebrated overseas. In 1957, when it premiered at the Berlin International Film Festival, it won the Golden Bear, the festival's top prize. Around the world, critics saw it as a bold, uniquely American story of democracy in action. At a time when America was presenting itself as the leader of the free world, 12 Angry Men became an ambassador of American values. Ironically, it was more appreciated abroad than at home. As we dig deeper into the strange facts of this movie, the story only becomes more powerful. What began as a simple television play turned into one of the greatest films of all time, carried forward by faith, struggle, and vision. And yet, there are still more layers, more forgotten truths behind the making of this masterpiece. When people look back on the making of 12 Angry Men, they often imagine it as a smooth march toward greatness, as if everyone involved somehow knew they were creating a classic. But the truth is stranger. The film was stitched together out of doubt, risk, and sheer stubbornness. Henry Fonda himself used to say that the film was saved, not by certainty, but by faith. The kind of faith that one man has to hold on to, even when the rest of the world tells him he's wasting his time. That faith held the movie together, but it also explains some of the strangest and most moving facts about how it came to life. The 11th strange fact is one that speaks directly to the audience of older Americans who lived through the 1950s. The entire film was shot on a shoestring budget. In fact, 12 Angry Men cost less than most television pilots of the time. The budget was under $400,000, an almost laughable amount even in those days, when big studio films cost several $1,000,000 to make. What this meant was that every decision had to be careful. There was no money for elaborate sets, no money for expensive costumes, no room for second chances. Everything had to be rehearsed, planned, and executed with precision. That kind of financial pressure could have crushed a project. Instead, it gave the film a raw discipline that still shows. Today, there are no wasted moments, no extra flourishes. It is bare, unadorned truth, just like the American jury system it portrays. And yet, the 12th strange fact is that the actors were not treated like stars. They were treated like theater players. Sidney Lumet believed in the rehearsal method. He had learned from television and the stage. So before filming began, he locked the cast in a room for 2 weeks with nothing but the script. They read it, acted it, argued it, ate together, sweated together. By the time the cameras rolled, they weren't just pretending to be jurors. They felt like jurors. They knew the rhythm of sitting in that room day after day, with tempers rising and patience thinning. You can see it in the way they shift in their chairs, the way they snap at each other, the way they slump against the walls. That lived-in feeling was no accident. Lumet forced it into existence. But the 13th fact reveals something even stranger. Henry Fonda hated watching himself on film. He thought he looked stiff, too serious, too wooden. After 12 Angry Men was released, he couldn't bring himself to view it again for years. Imagine that the man who carried the movie on his back, the man whose presence as juror number 8 has become legendary, was too uncomfortable to watch his own performance. For Fonda, the film was not about ego. It wasn't about being a star. It was about the message. And that message, that a single voice of reason can stand against the tide, was what mattered most to him. That humility, that self-doubt, is part of what makes his performance so human and believable. Now, the 14th fact takes us into the strange little choices that gave the film its unforgettable texture. Lumet instructed the cinematographer, Boris Kaufman, to gradually lower the camera angles as the film progressed. At the beginning, the shots are taken from slightly above, giving the sense that the men have space, that the room is still open. As the arguments deepen, the camera lowers until by the end, it is shooting from just below eye level, trapping the men against the ceiling, making the room feel smaller and smaller. Viewers may not consciously notice it, but they feel it in their bones. That creeping claustrophobia is part of why the film still grips audiences today. It is not just dialogue. It is cinematic architecture, designed to squeeze the audience's chest until they, too, feel the pressure of deciding a boy's fate. The 15th fact is the one that touches people most deeply. The movie was, in its heart, a love letter to democracy. Reginald Rose had lived through the war years. He had seen how fragile freedom could be, how easily justice could be bent or broken. He believed that the American jury system, imperfect as it was one of the last great equalizers, a place where ordinary men could rise above their weaknesses and stand for something larger than themselves. That belief shines through every line of the script. Even in its darkest moments, when the ugliest prejudices come spilling out, the film insists that reason, compassion, and fairness can win. In 1957, at a time when America was torn between hope and division, that was a radical statement. And for older generations who lived through that era, the film is a reminder of what America could be at its best. But the film's history doesn't stop at the facts of production. Its legacy has been just as strange and just as powerful in the years that followed. When it failed at the box office, most people assumed it would fade into obscurity. But something unusual began to happen. Teachers started showing it in classrooms. Law professors began using it to explain reasonable doubt. Activists began pointing to it as an example of how one person could make a difference. And slowly, without anyone noticing at first, the film grew into one of the most respected works of American culture. And yet, here lies another layer of strangeness. In some ways, the film has become even more powerful over time than it was in 1957. Watching it today, people see not just a drama about a trial, but a reflection of everything America continues to struggle with: prejudice, justice, truth, and the courage to stand alone. In that sense, the movie has outlived its own moment. It has become timeless. Think about it. 12 ordinary men, sweating in a small room, wrestling over the life of a boy they don't even know. That is America in miniature. That is the dream of a country where truth is not dictated from above, but hammered out painfully in the hearts of ordinary people. That is why the film endures. That is why, after all these years, it still grips the imagination of Americans who care about justice, fairness, and the fragile beauty of democracy. And as we move forward in the story, there are still stranger and more touching truths to uncover. Behind the cameras, in the lives of the men who played those jurors, and in the quiet ripple effect the movie left on American culture, there are more surprises waiting. When people talk about 12 Angry Men today, they often focus on the story within the jury room, the slow unraveling of assumptions, the clash between prejudice and fairness, the courage of one man standing against 11. But there is another story, quieter, hidden behind the faces of those actors who sat around that table. For every juror on screen, there was a real man off screen, bringing his own history, his own struggles, and his own dreams into that room. And sometimes those stories are as strange and as moving as the film itself. Take Lee J. Cobb, who played juror number 3, the hot-headed, stubborn man who becomes the film's most powerful antagonist. Cobb's performance is unforgettable, his voice booming, his fists slamming the table, his face twisted with rage as he tries to force a guilty verdict. Yet here is the strange fact. Cobb almost didn't take the role. At the time, he was weary of playing angry, difficult men. He had made a career of tough guys and villains, and he feared being typecast yet again. But when he read the script, something struck him. He saw in juror number 3 not just anger, but heartbreak. He saw the broken father underneath, the man estranged from his own son, lashing out not only at the accused boy on trial, but at his own failures. That recognition cut deep into Cobb's soul. He took the role, and his performance became one of the greatest of his career. Audiences still talk about the final moment, when juror number 3 breaks down, ripping up the photograph of his son, finally letting go of his rage. That scene wasn't just acting. For Cobb, it was exorcism. He had lived through personal demons, political persecution, and professional struggles. He poured it all into that final collapse. Then there was E.G. Marshall, juror number 4, the calm, rational man with the glasses who insists on sticking to the facts. Marshall was known in real life for his sharp mind and quiet authority. And here lies the 12th strange detail about the cast. During filming, Marshall almost never spoke to his fellow actors outside of rehearsals. He kept to himself, reading, preparing, staying in character as the logical, detached juror. The others joked that he was really juror number 4, even when the cameras weren't rolling. That distance gave his performance an edge of authenticity. He seemed apart, untouched by emotion, speaking with the cold clarity of reason. Jack Warden, juror number 7, brought a completely different energy. Known later for his comedic roles, Warden in this film is the wisecracking salesman, the man who doesn't want to be there, who just wants the trial to be over so he can get to his baseball game. Here is the strange fact about Warden. He had been a professional boxer before becoming an actor. He carried that toughness with him, the sense of a man who had lived hard, fought for survival, and didn't care much for rules when he slouched. In his chair, when he mocked the seriousness of the proceedings, it wasn't just acting. That was Warden's own disdain for authority, shining through. But perhaps the strangest casting choice was Joseph Sweeney, juror number 9, the frail old man, who ultimately delivers some of the film's most heartfelt insights. Sweeney had actually played the same role 3 years earlier, in the original television version. When the film was made, most of the TV cast was replaced with better-known names. But Lumet insisted that Sweeney come back. He believed no one else could play the role with the same dignity, the same quiet wisdom. And he was right. Audiences remember juror number 9's trembling but steady voice, standing up for compassion in the face of cruelty. At the time of filming, Sweeney was nearly 70 years old, one of the oldest working actors in Hollywood. He had been acting since the days of vaudeville, and 12 Angry Men became the crowning jewel of his long career. The cast was a strange mix, some theater actors, some film veterans, some television men. Yet when they came together, they created a kind of alchemy. Each brought his own history, his own style, and together they formed a mosaic of American manhood in the 1950s. That is part of why the film feels so real. When you watch it, you don't see actors playing roles. You see 12 men, each different, each flawed, each human dot. And here is another forgotten truth. During the making of the film, tensions between the actors sometimes mirrored the tensions of their characters. Long days in the hot studio made tempers flare. Arguments broke out, not just in character, but in real life. Sidney Lumet encouraged it. He believed that the natural friction would bleed into their performances, adding to the realism. And it did. You can sense the irritation in the way they snap at each other, the exhaustion in the way they slump in their chairs. None of it feels staged. because much of it WASN single quotes T, that there is also a strange and moving story behind Ed Begley, who played juror number 10, the bitter man whose prejudice finally erupts in one of the film's most chilling speeches. In real life, Begley was known as a kind, gentle man. Playing such a venomous role disturbed him, but Lumet urged him to go deeper, to bring out the ugliness that lurked in America at that time. The result is unforgettable. When juror number 10 unleashes his hateful tirade, one by one the other jurors rise and turn their backs on him, refusing to listen. That moment has become one of the most iconic in American cinema, not just because of the words, but because of the silence that follows, the silence of rejection. It was a statement about America itself, about the possibility of turning away from hate. And for Begley, it was one of the hardest performances of his career. He was so shaken by it that he avoided watching the scene afterward. All of this shows how deeply the film was tied to its time. The late 1950s were years of tension in America. The Cold War hung like a shadow. Civil rights battles were beginning to heat up, and questions of justice and fairness were on everyone's mind. That is why 12 Angry Men struck such a chord, even if audiences didn't recognize it right away. It was more than just a jury drama. It was America on trial. Every prejudice, every fear, every hope, all of it was packed into that one room. The strangest thing of all, perhaps, is how the film grew in stature over the decades. At first it was forgotten. Then it became a teaching tool. Then it became a classic. Today, it is part of the Library of Congress's National Film Registry, preserved as a piece of American heritage. Students still watch it in schools. Lawyers still quote it in lectures. Judges still recommend it as the best film ever made about the jury system. It has become, in its own way, a kind of civic text, a reminder of what America promises, even when it falls short. And for the men who made it, the film left a deep mark. Henry Fonda, who had doubted his own performance, eventually came to see it as one of the most meaningful works of his career. Sidney Lumet went on to direct dozens of films, but he always said that 12 Angry Men remained closest to his heart, because it captured something raw, something honest, something that could never quite be repeated. The film endures not because of spectacle, not because of special effects, but because it tells a simple, eternal truth. One person can make a difference. One voice can change the course of justice. One man, standing alone, can remind the rest of us what fairness truly means. That is why people still watch it, still talk about it, still feel moved by it after all these years. And yet, there are even more hidden stories to uncover. The strange afterlife of the film, the way it echoed through politics and culture, the way it inspired remakes, tributes, and debates. The journey of 12 Angry Men did not end in 1957. In many ways, it was only beginning. As the years rolled forward, 12 Angry Men moved quietly from being a modest, almost forgotten courtroom film into something much larger. It became part of America's conscience, a touchstone for how this nation wanted to see itself. Flawed, divided, but still capable of fairness, still capable of rising above anger and prejudice when it mattered most. That transformation from box office disappointment to cultural monument is one of the strangest and most inspiring facts about its legacy. For many Americans who lived through the late 1950s and into the turbulent 1960s, the film became more than a story about a single jury. It became a reflection of the country itself. 12 men, each carrying their own fears, resentments, and biases, locked in a room until they found the courage to listen to one another. Was that not the story of America in those years? The civil rights movement was rising, the country was splitting over race, class, and ideology, and at every turn, Americans were being asked to decide what kind of nation they wanted to be. In classrooms and lecture halls, teachers began using the film not only to discuss law, but also to discuss democracy. They told their students, "This is America right here. This is what we are and what we must try to be." Strange fact number 16 lies in how the film crossed boundaries it was never meant to cross. When it was first made, no one thought of it as a political statement. It was just a story about a jury. But as the civil rights struggle deepened, viewers began to see it differently. The unnamed boy on trial became, in the imagination of many, a black teenager, or a Latino youth, or any marginalized young man whose fate was too often sealed by prejudice before he ever set foot in a courtroom. The film never identified his race. That silence became its power. Every viewer could project their own America onto that boy, and in doing so, they could confront their own prejudices. In fact, during the 1960s, civil rights leaders sometimes referred to the film as a quiet ally. It showed, without speeches or slogans, how dangerous unchecked bias could be. It showed how one man's courage to resist could ripple outward and change the course of justice. It is not too much to say that 12 Angry Men became a kind of moral parable for the civil rights era. But here is another strange twist. While the film was ignored at the American box office, it became a hit overseas. In countries struggling under dictatorships or authoritarian rule, audiences saw it as a story of freedom. In Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe, people whispered about it as a vision of what justice might look like if ordinary citizens truly had a voice. In Latin America, where courtrooms were often symbols of corruption, the film played like a dream of fairness. Even in places where democracy was weak, the story of 12 men wrestling honestly with the truth struck a nerve. It was as though 12 angry men spoke in a universal language, one that needed no translation. Justice, fairness, doubt, courage. These were human values, not just American ones. The 17th strange fact comes from the film's unlikely journey into classrooms. By the 1970s, 12 Angry Men was being shown regularly to high school civics, classes, college law students, and even police academies. Professors used it to spark debates about reasonable doubt, the dangers of prejudice, and the responsibility of jurors. Judges recommended it to new lawyers. And young Americans, sitting in dim classrooms watching the black and white faces argue on the screen, began to see the jury system not as a dull civic duty, but as something alive, something filled with moral weight. For many, 12 Angry Men was the first time they truly grasped what innocent until proven guilty meant. That is an extraordinary legacy for a film that nearly disappeared in 1957. And yet, the story did not stop there. In 1997, a television remake of 12 Angry Men was made, starring Jack Lemmon and George C. Scott. It was updated with a more diverse cast, reflecting the changing face of America. For younger generations, this version became their introduction to the story. But even then, critics agreed that nothing could surpass the raw power of the original. Sidney Lumet's version, with its stark black and white photography and unpolished intensity, remained unmatched. Here lies the 18th strange fact. 12 Angry Men has been remade or reinterpreted in dozens of countries, in multiple languages, sometimes with entirely different cultural contexts. In China, in India, in Germany, in the Middle East, directors have staged their own versions of the story, each time adapting the 12 jurors into the cultural setting of their own legal systems. And yet, the essence remains the same. A small group of ordinary citizens deciding the fate of another human being while wrestling with their own biases. That universality is what has kept the story alive for Americans, though the original remains a uniquely nostalgic experience. It captures a time when men wore white shirts and ties, when they smoked cigarettes as they argued, when they sweated under fans in a summer heat that seemed endless. It is a time capsule of 1950s America. The look, the feel, the rhythm of speech. For older viewers, it brings back the memory of those years, when the country was simpler in some ways, harsher in others, and still wrestling with its own contradictions. That nostalgia gives the film a double power. It is not only a lesson in justice, but also a window into a vanished America. The 19th strange fact is about the Library of Congress. In 1989, when the National Film Registry was created to preserve films of cultural and historical importance, 12 Angry Men was among the very first movies selected. That choice signaled its transformation from forgotten failure to national treasure. It meant that the film would be preserved for all time, alongside the greatest works of American cinema. For a movie shot on a shoestring budget, nearly abandoned by its own producer, that is nothing short of miraculous. But the film's power is not just in history. Even today, it continues to inspire. In 2019, a group of students in Florida staged a reenactment of the film as part of a debate program. Afterwards, they said it had changed how they saw the world. They realized how easy it was to rush to judgment, how important it was to slow down, to listen, to doubt. That is the film's deepest legacy. It teaches, again and again, that fairness requires patience, that truth requires courage, and that justice is not automatic. It is something we have to fight for, one argument at a time. The 20th and final strange fact is perhaps the most moving of all. Henry Fonda, who once swore he would never produce another film after 12 Angry Men's box office failure, lived long enough to see it become recognized as a masterpiece. In his later years, he spoke of it with quiet pride, calling it one of the most meaningful things he had ever done. He said it wasn't about him, or even about the other actors. It was about America, about showing what democracy looked like in action. And when he died in 1982, critics and fans alike remembered him not only for The Grapes of Wrath or On Golden Pond, but also as the lone juror who had the courage to stand up and say, "I'm not sure. I think we should talk about it." In the end, that is why 12 Angry Men still matters. It reminds us that democracy doesn't live in grand speeches or marble halls. It lives in small rooms, in ordinary people, in the moments when we choose to listen, to argue, to doubt, to stand up for what is right. That is the strange, beautiful truth of this film. That is why it has lasted. And that is why, even now, more than 60 years later, it still speaks to us, as Americans, as citizens, and as human beings.